This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Keep watching for more information and a special offer. It seems that a number of people are worried that the German government is going full Adolf Hitler, and I didn't even get to the end of my first sentence before mentioning that name. If true, then it is obviously very worrying, so let's take a look and see what is actually going on. It's related to the government's efforts to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, which has seen government restrictions on things like, for example, freedom of assembly. Now that is a very serious curtailment of some basic democratic rights, so it's hardly surprising that a lot of people have objected to that. What's got some people extremely worried is that the Bundestag has decided to make some changes to the Infection Protection Act. And even as I say it, I realise how ridiculous the English translation sounds, but there it is. Now, this law contains a clause which allows the government to issue emergency ordinances in order to combat an epidemic. In other words, to deal with a dangerous situation, the government can make regulations without needing to go through the whole process of making a new law. As long as the courts agree that the regulations are appropriate and do not infringe on people's rights more than is absolutely necessary to actually fight the disease, it's legal. This clause is very vague though and doesn't really set any definite limits. It essentially says that the relevant authorities can take whatever steps are necessary, and even confirms that basic rights can be curtailed. As this pandemic dragged on, and especially when the second wave hit, courts and politicians started to get a bit uneasy. Were we in danger of allowing a government to rule by decree? So a new section has been added to this law. It basically goes into a bit more detail about exactly what is allowed and what the limits are. It includes a list of specific measures that can be taken, and also requires that any such ordinance expires after 4 weeks maximum. Of course, if the situation demands it, the ordinance can be renewed for a further 4 weeks, but that has to be justified. The government can no longer issue an ordinance that stays in place until further notice. So why are people so worried about it? Surely this new section actually puts limits on what the government's allowed to do, and that's a good thing, right? Well, it turns out there are 2 reasons why people complained. One sensible reason, and one reason that, how can I put this tactfully, is based on a misunderstanding. The sensible reason first. The version that's just passed is not the version that was originally drafted. That original version really was criticised very harshly, and even some judges said they felt it was unconstitutional and unjustified. But that's not the version that was passed. It was revised quite radically in order to address those concerns. And that is part of the normal democratic process working exactly as it was intended to. And then there is the other reason. You see, the whole discussion about this amendment was about the basis for empowerment, that is, empowering the government to issue ordinances. But the German phrase that was used reminded people of the infamous Enabling Act of 1933, which was a crucial step in the Nazis' power grab. But that's just a word. The important thing is not that a law enables a government to do something. Lots of laws do that. The important thing is what a law enables a government to do. An Enabling Act is a primitive kind of emergency legislation. So emergency legislation is needed because any government could at any time be faced with an unexpected, emergency, and may need to take drastic steps to deal with it very quickly. For example, suppose a massive earthquake hits a major city. A government might want to be able to do things that it's not normally allowed to do. For example, send in the army. What a German government had in the 1930s was the ability to temporarily suspend parts of the constitution, and for that they needed an Enabling Act. The situation in early 1933 was this. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, so the Nazis, was the largest party in the Reichstag and was in a governing coalition with the German National People's Party. But the goal of the Nazis was to rule alone and unopposed. The Reichstag was actually meeting in an opera house because the Reichstag building had burned down just a few weeks previously. Exactly who set fire to it and why is disputed, but the Nazis basically said it just goes to show how dangerous the communists are. And so they said that they needed an enabling act to deal with the threat of what we today would call terrorism. But there was a problem. Enabling acts were very powerful pieces of legislation, and so they were very difficult to pass. They first had to be debated by at least 2/3 of the members of the Reichstag. But the Nazi Party had already had members of the Communist Party arrested. And if all the members of the moderate left-wing SPD made good on their promise and simply walked out of the debate, followed by only 15 others, that would have left fewer than 2/3 of the members of the Reichstag in the chamber, which would have meant no debate could be held and therefore no enabling act could be passed. So, before the debate on the Enabling Act, the Nazis tabled a simple change to the rules of parliamentary procedure. This only needed a simple majority to pass, and it passed. From that moment on, anybody who was absent from the chamber without first giving a valid reason was officially considered to be present. And those Communist Party members who were in prison or on the run? Well, they hadn't informed the Reichstag of their absence, and so they had no excuse, and so they were officially present. And the SPD couldn't stop the debate simply by walking out. After that, there needed to be a vote, and that vote needed to pass with a 2/3 majority. Now, obviously, with so many members of the Reichstag officially present but actually unable to vote, and with the SPD clearly about to vote no, the Nazis needed to make sure that they had the support of all the other parties, and not all of them were entirely on board. The biggest of these was the Centre Party, which was really sceptical about the whole thing. But Hitler promised them that certain safeguards would remain in place to ensure that the new powers could not be abused, which the Centre Party eventually and reluctantly accepted. As it turned out, though, Hitler had lied. What are the chances? Not only that, but there were armed members of the SA and SS in the chamber, plus some credible reports that some members of the Centre Party were personally threatened. So the Enabling Act passed, and it passed easily, and boy was it radical. It gave the government the authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval. In other words, it was basically a piece of paper that says, we hereby give the Nazi Party permission to do whatever it wants. The fact that this was called an Enabling Act doesn't mean that every time we have a discussion and use a similar word, we're talking about stripping away everybody's rights. This amendment to an existing law simply lists specific things that a government is allowed to do in order to combat an epidemic, and that is it. Many thanks to ExpressVPN for supporting this channel. If you're looking for a reliable VPN service, then use the link in the description to sign up for a 12-month subscription and get the first 3 months free. The Nazis before the debate on the very infamous 1933